The reason why our dreams are so strange is because we're no longer constrained by the data with which we predict reality. Like there are no walls, we can, I guess the input that we're using is not there. That's why when someone says to sleep on a problem that you can't figure out while on a piece of paper, while when you sleep, you can actually often solve these problems because reality is no longer there. 1 minute you can be in Sussex, the other one you can be in Ibiza, and the next dogs can cook and pigs can fly. All these things are possible. So we don't necessarily have awareness in our dreams that these things don't make sense. So are we really conscious when we're asleep in that aspect?
Well, yes. I mean, I think the short answer there is, I mean, dreams are fascinating. They always have been. They're really tricky to study scientifically, of course, though, because when someone's asleep, dreaming, it's very difficult to have them tell you what they're dreaming about because they're asleep. So it's problematic. There's some people are trying to do this now, and dreams, for me, they're canonical examples of conscious experiences. So the idea that you're not conscious when you're dreaming, to me, doesn't really make sense, because for me, the definition of being conscious is not being able to reflect or make sense of anything. It's just the raw fact that there is experience going on. So when you're under general anesthesia, sure, you're unconscious. That's the point of general anesthesia. There is nothing going on. You're gone and you're back, and you don't even know how long it was that you were gone for. But when you're dreaming, the whole point we call them dreams is because there's something going on. There's something it is like to be dreaming. But it's just a very different phenomenological character. I was getting annoyed this week. I don't generally remember my dreams. Of course, if you remember which is a good thing, because if you remembered your dreams all the time, you would get very confused about what happened in a dream and what happened in reality. It'd be very problematic to continually make these confusions. So don't worry if you don't always remember your dreams. But I do remember a few of them. And in this last week, I kept having these, typical anxiety dream for me is almost missing a plane, running through an airport. I'm late. I've got to the wrong gate. I'm missing it. And I just think it's really unfair of my brain at the moment to be imposing dreams about missing planes when that is absolutely not an option at the moment. But
that's really interesting.
It's still a very open question what they're for. And there is one idea that I quite like, and it's still just an idea, is that this whole story of perceiving the world through these predictions that we impose upon sensory data, well, that requires technically some sort of internal model of the causes of the data, so sort of internal representation of the causal structure of the world. And in artificial intelligence and machine learning, we know that if you have too complex a model, it tends to overfit the data. It doesn't generalize well to new situations. So one idea that's happening in dreams is that the generative models in our brain that underwrite the perceptual predictions that we apply to the world, what's happening is that they're being finessed, they're being pruned. So they get more during the day, we get exposed to more data, the models get more complex. And then by sort of just free running the models in the brain during dreaming, we can reduce the model complexity, and so that they might generalize better the next morning. So I kind of like that, because it's a mechanical explanation of why dreams have this sort of florid phenomenology that they do.
You mentioned anesthesia. So what's the difference between people being under anesthesia or actually being in a coma or unconscious in a vegetative state?
Yeah, not that much, which is probably not what you want to hear when you're going in for an operation. But actually, you should want to hear it, because anesthesia is not just going to sleep for a while. I mean, if you were just going to sleep, then you wouldn't stay asleep once operation started. And so you need a more profound state of unconsciousness. And for those people who've had general anesthesia, I've had it a few times, the differences to sleep are just night and day, to use a bad analogy. But when you go to sleep, even if you're not dreaming, you know that a period of time has passed. You're not going to be out by multiple hours. You might be out, if you've got jet lag, you might be out by a few hours, but you know you've been away and you're now back. But under general anesthesia, there's no perception of the intervening interval. And this doesn't seem to be just a case of amnesia. This is a case of you really not being there during this time. And if you look at the patterns of brain activity under deep general anesthesia, they have a lot more in common with what you see in coma or in the vegetative state. So these are clinical conditions which involve profound loss of consciousness than sleep. And indeed, a medically induced coma is nothing more than just the continual maintenance of a deep general anesthesia state.
Mm-hmm. So does that mean, do we really know where it originates in the brain?
It's a very, I mean, all these questions have very long, could talk about for hours. I mean, in some sense, yes, but there are parts of the brain that we know are essential for being conscious. Mm-hmm. But whether these are the places that in which consciousness originates, that's a different question. So there might be, if you turn there are things like on-off switches for any kind of electrical appliance. Just knowing that there's an on-off switch for something doesn't tell you that on-off switch explains the functioning of the device. So there are certain nuclei in our brain stems, small collections of neurons deep in our brains, that if they get damaged or we shut them down for something, you will lose consciousness. But that doesn't mean, to me, is that like an on-off switch, or is that where consciousness is generated? Right. So for me, and I think the kind of emerging story is that the sort of necessary substrates for consciousness in the brain is quite widespread. It's quite distributed. It involves patterns of activity that go between the cortex, the surface of the brain, and the thalamus deep within the brain. And now you can intervene in that process in multiple ways. There are multiple pathways to generate unconsciousness. Mm-hmm. But to be conscious, the whole system has to be active in a particular way. And finessing this idea is actually something that's going on with colleagues of mine in across the world, really, but especially in Italy, in Milan. Friend and colleague Marcello Massimini, who's been developing these systems that just look at how functionally connected the brain is as a way of measuring how conscious somebody is, independently of what they say, independently of their behavior. And this has massive clinical importance because for something like the vegetative state, this is a state where people are diagnosed as lacking consciousness, even though they go through sleep and wake cycles. But they don't show any voluntary activity. They don't respond to any questions or anything like that. But if you can apply a measure of conscious level directly to brain activity, you can start to see whether any of these conditions may have been misdiagnosed. Mm-hmm. And it turns out that there is some fraction of people diagnosed as unconscious because they show no behavior consistent with consciousness. Yet, if you look inside the brain through these methods, you can see, there's actually signatures of residual consciousness there. And that really makes a difference. That is already making a difference to people's lives.